So it has come to this. We are going to talk about verbs on the channel again. We're going to look specifically at active voice, passive voice, and then deponent verbs as their own subset and how to form each of them. If you're in Latin 1, you probably are only going to care about the active voice part. If you're in Latin 2, the passive and deponent will matter a great deal to you. So let's start with active. Active voice just means that your subject, okay, whatever's in the nominative, performs the action. Reason in class you get typed up notes is because my handwriting looks like that. These are the endings you remember from Latin 1. These are the classic O, S, T, M, U, S, T, I, S, N, T. The ones that in class we've always sung as the Mickey Mouse Club endings. The O, S, T, M, U, S, T, I, S, N, T. It's a verb. Woo. The only variation we ever see on this is that instead of an O, sometimes we get an M. We've seen this in a number of our verbs like sum. And when we go to the imperfect, because we'd have an A at the end of it, and Latin doesn't like going from an A to an O, it goes from an A to an M. So we've known these endings all along. The only variation, the only problem that's probably ever come up for you is when you go to the imperfect, sorry, not the imperfect, the perfect tense, and we have E, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt, with a U-N-T. And these are weird and they don't look normal, except that they actually are very normal. We, again, have just a lone vowel as our first person singular, the I form of all of this. For our second person, we still have that S emerging. And then the rest of them actually completely are normal to what we've seen. We've got a T, an MUS, a TIS, and an NT at the end of all the other forms. All we have to do for any of these is take our stem, whatever way we're finding it, which we'll address in just a moment, and add these endings, and it means that I, as the subject, perform the action of the verb. You, as the subject, perform the action of the verb. He, she, it, whatever noun happens to be the nominative, whether it's Regina, whether it's Rex, whether it's Aeneas or Dido, they perform the action of the verb. We perform the action of the verb. We're here in the South, so I'm going to say y'all perform the action of the verb, and they, again, anything in the nominative, performing that. So let's actually form a few of these. If we have a normal sort of verb, a first conjugation verb, a second conjugation verb, we'll be generic and go with amo, amare for our first conjugation verb, and moeo, moere for our second conjugation verb. Again, I know this is first because it has an A-R-E. I know this is a second conjugation verb because it has an E with a macron, R-E. Again, as we say in class, we know it's second because there are two things we're looking for, the E and the long mark. For either of these sort of verbs, all we have to do is more or less cut off our RE for our stem, and then we can add our endings. So when we look at something like moeo, we get moe, move, as our stem over and over and over again. For the sake of space, I'm going to have to go singular and then plural down here. And to that, we just add all of those endings. That O, S, T, M, U, S, T, I, S, N, T. It's a verb. And again, to translate these, we just have a different subject. I move. You move. He, she, it, something in the nominative moves. We move. Y'all, again, we're here in the South, we'll say this, y'all move, and they move. It's all it takes for forming an active voice present tense verb for a first or second conjugation. Thirds and fourths are just a little bit different, mainly because they involve the vowel I, and as we like to joke in class, I am weak. Without you, of course, it's a follow-up on that and what we'll see with this. So if we have a verb like my beloved mitto, mittere, to send, and we have a fourth conjugation like winio, like Caesar's famous Waney Witty Wiki, I came, I saw, I conquered. We know this is third because we have an ERE, but there's no macron. We know this is fourth because we have an IRE. Macron doesn't even matter in that case. These get a little weirder on the stems. There are different ways you can get there, but so long as you get to the right place is all we care about. I like saying that for the third, you go to the first principal part so that you get the stem mit. The pure morpheme telling us that this means send. If we cut off the RE, we'd end up with an E, and that's not what we want for present tense. So we have to look at having some slightly different sort of forms with all of this. We still will have our O, we'll have our S, our T, our MUS, TIS in T, but now we need to change our vowels. We've already got an O there. We end up with an I, an I, an I, an I, but Latin hates an INT. The vowel I is way too weak to support two consonants after it most of the time. So instead of putting an I, we put a U. Again, this is just a matter of forming them, which is not something we do frequently in Latin. You can. It's an excellent practice, a good, best practice for you to make sure that you're learning this, but it's not something you have to do. You need to be able to recognize when you see mittet, knowing that this is a present active verb, mitunt, again, present active verb, not any other sort of form. Fourth conjugation, you can get there either way that we've already done. You can go to the second principal part and drop the RE like we did with amo and moeo, or you can do it like you do with the mito and cut off the O, and either way you get the same stem. You don't get the same stem if you try that with third conjugation, but you do with a fourth conjugation. So we end up with that stem, whinny. And to that, we just add our old beloved active indicative endings, O, S, T, M-U-S, T-I-S. We will have an NT, but again, the vowel I is too weak to support the two consonants after it, so we add a U, or as we say in class, I am weak without you. That's all that happens with active voice. You can do this with any of our tenses. Imperfect, you just end up adding the BA and sometimes with some other vowels to help support that morpheme in there. For the future tense, we add our bo, bi, boo for first and second conjugations and an A and an E for the third and fourth, or as we say in class, bo, bi, boo for 1 and 2, A and E for 4 and 3. When you go to the perfect tense for the active voice, all you're doing is forming your stem in a different place. Going to that third principal part, so we'll use amo this time, since we used moeo before. For our stem, we're going to go to the third principal part, or as we like to say in class, we're crossing the Rubicon, and we get that amav for our stem. Because we're cutting the I off of the V. And not every verb will have a V. Most first conjugations, most, not all, but most will have an AVI. Most of the rest of perfect stems, whatever conjugation they are, they should have a long vowel, an X, a S, a U, a V, or a reduplicatives like dedi and tatigi. So again, we've got this stem, amav. Since I have the space, I'm going to do 2-column version as opposed to the 1-column version. And to that, we just add our perfect endings, which are those E, isti, it, emas, istis, erunt. And yes, the third person plural just looks weird relative to all the rest of them, but that's just how it is. It's one of those things that you need to recognize, not necessarily something you have to produce all the time unless you want to do Latin composition and spoken Latin. So that's all it takes for active voice, normal sort of verbs. Now we're going to look at passive voice, which again, if you're a Latin 1 student, elementary sort of student, this is not something you're probably going to encounter for a little while. It's also a little difficult for us when we have to talk about it in English because most English teachers tell you don't use the passive voice, whereas Latin does not care. It enjoys using the passive voice. So for the passive voice, what changes is your subject, whatever's in the nominative. Again, why you get typed up notes in class. It receives the action. So the example I like to give in class is that if I walked in and said, my car was totaled last night, you would have sympathy for me and feel sorry and worry about the state of poor little Binky. If I walked in and said, I wrecked my car last night, you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. You have so many speeding tickets. What were you doing? What we do with passive, which is what the first one is, we take what would have been the direct object in a normal active sentence, what is now our subject, and it gets the action. My car is the subject, and it got wrecked. It got totaled. It was totaled. It was wrecked, is how we'd normally say that in English, not so much the got anymore, but we can. It has a different nuance to it, but all it's going to do is change our endings. Instead of having that O-S-T, M-U-S-T-I-S-N-T, it's a verb, woo. We now are going to use ris, ter, mer, many, inter, which is just spelled with the N, T-U-R. And please notice that these are U-Rs, not E-Rs, appearing in all of these. Students who want to remember this have a tendency to sing the ris, ter, mer, many, inter sort of pattern for Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie, or you can go the generic Ice Ice Baby version of it, but ris, ter, mer, many, inter, ris, ter, mer, many, inter. And all we're going to do is form our stem the exact same way and add these endings to it. So if we had amo, we have that AMA stem from dropping RRE. Only difference is our first person. We keep that O on there, and then we add our ris, ter, mer, many, inter. So instead of saying amo, I love, we now have amor, I am loved. Instead of amaris, you love, as we had with amas, now we have you are loved. Amater, he, she, it is loved. Aeneas is loved by his mother Venus, not so much by Dido later on. Amamer, we are loved. Amamini, y'all, again we're here in the South, we'll say y'all are loved. And amanter, they are loved. We use a little helping verb, a linking verb, whichever way you want to think about it, of an, is, are, those variations, and then we use what is technically a kind of past participle in English so that we can make a passive. And that's all you have to do with any of the verbs. The same way you found the stem, the same vowel combinations that you used in the present active, you also use in the present passive. The only thing that has changed is instead of O-S-T, M-U-S-T-I-S-N-T, we now have ris, ter, mer, many, inter. This holds true for present, for imperfect, for future. The perfect system for the passive is quite different. For anything that is perfect and passive, I'm going to go back to using blue to evoke our idea of the Rubicon. We need to go to a later principal part, and we're going to use that. So if we have that verb, amo, amare, amawi, amatum, notice I abbreviated the ones that aren't going to matter for this. We want to go to that last principal part, amatum. Now, this can be any gender. I've done the neuter because I like using my fourth principal part of the supine, and I like to remind myself that we will have an accusative supine every so often. There are folks who always like to use the US or the A or some other sort of ending. We're going to use the A just so that we can have a clear gender on these forms, and we would have amata as its own whole word. And then after that, we would add, as a whole separate word, I'm going to draw another line so we know there's a space, sum. I was loved. I have been loved. We wouldn't necessarily say I did be loved, but you could if you really, really wanted to write that way. We go for an S, again with a space in between them. An est on this last one. She has been loved. She was loved. And then something a little odd happens when we go to the plural. We can't use just an A because that is a singular sort of ending, so we have to put a plural feminine ending there if we're dealing with feminine subjects. If we were dealing with masculine subjects, we would have a masculine ending. If we were dealing with neuter subjects, if you really feel that strongly about rocks, then hey, you can use a neuter ending on those. And again, as a whole separate word, we're going to put sumus. As a whole separate word, we're going to put estis. And as a whole separate word, we're going to put sunt. So just like in English, when we use the passive voice, we use forms of the verb to be as our helping, linking, whatever way you want to refer to it, sort of verbs in this. Latin does that too, but only in their perfect system. The only thing that would change for pluperfect and future perfect, of course, is that we would use a different tense of our helping verb, just like you would in English. Use I am in the present, use I was in the past, and you would use I will be in the future. All right, so that is kind of what passive is. This is a real quick rundown on all these, just a review on this. Let's look now at a completely different set of words that is more a vocab issue than it actually is a grammar issue, in my opinion, and those are things called deponents. They are just a subset of words, handful of them, no more than 500 in the entire Latin language, and most of them are just compounds of a core about 50 verbs that you're ever going to see that look passive, which means they're going to use the aorist, term, and the inter endings. They're going to use having two separate word forms for their perfect system, but we translate them as active. Again, this is a vocab issue. Most of the time, if you were translating this in a sentence, it would not make sense for you suddenly to try and render the verb in the passive voice. Many of them, their definitions don't even lend themselves that well to that. It's just a matter of when you see these and you see passive endings, you still can recognize the subject for each one, you can recognize the tense for each one, and when you start translating, they should hopefully make sense as an active translation. So if we took a nice simple sort of verb, let's go with canor, canari, canatum, canatus, canata. Folks do variations on this. And this is just a verb for to try. One of the first things we notice is we only have three principal parts. Only three, because we can have a first person singular present indicative. We have a present infinitive. And then we have what would have been our last principal part in any other sort of verb that we're going to use for our perfect passive stem again. Same sort of deal applies. When we want our stem, we form it the exact same way. For first, second, and you could say fourth conjugation verbs, you go to the second principal part, cut off the R and the vowel that follows it, and then you've got your stem, kana, and these. If you were looking at a third conjugation verb, then yes, you'd have to go to your first principal part, cut off your OR, and then start adding in vowels. But let's go ahead and do the present deponent indicative of these. And I don't like referring to these as either active or passive because they're really not either. They're something that we don't necessarily have in English. So we have our stem, and now all we need to do is add our endings. So we have that ris, ter, mer, mini, and inter. Again, I try. Not I am tried. That's something else. That's weird. That's not something we'd express in Latin that way. I try. Canaris, you try. Canator, he, she, it tries. Canamer, we try. Canominy, y'all try. And canator, they try. That is all that happens with deponents. We're going to use passive endings, but active translations for them. I know in my class, we've got a list of just a handful of ones, about 35 that you'll see frequently enough in Latin that it should give you a base for what you're doing. Any other time we start seeing weird ones, I will probably point them out to you for a while until you start knowing how to look for them for yourselves. So that's all that's going on with active, passive, and deponent verbs. Have fun trying them on your own.